working, but you'll have to get really close.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. The Clinton County Historical Association is very pleased to welcome you to Fort Montgomery. The Truth is Stranger Than the Myths with local author and historian Jim Millard. Jim is the publisher of the award-winning website America's Historic Lakes and author of 4 books: Bastions on the Border, Lake Passages, A Journey Through the Centuries, The Secrets of Crab Island, and most importantly, Fort Montgomery Through the Years. A few years ago, the History Channel had a series called How the States Were Made. And on one episode, our beloved Fort Montgomery was featured, and it had 3 spots on the show. The picture of the fort was in the beginning and in the end, and then Jim had a whole part of the show to explain the Fort Blunder story, the moving the international border story, and Fort Montgomery. So Jim has been a very important part of organizing the Fort Montgomery Days, which were held in 2009, and it's hard to believe it's been 10 years since we did that event. We had about 2,000 people that came between Saturday and Sunday. And we were thinking about trying to do it again the following year, but the liability of the fort is just, it was more than any of us wanted to take on. Fort Montgomery Days had food, music, horse-drawn wagon rides, and tours of the fort by Jim and other volunteers. People came and stayed and talked, and then a lot of them even came back the following day. And everything was free except probably for the food, I think. But as far as coming to the fort and the tours, everything was open to the public. I myself personally have been on 7 tours of the fort with Jim. And I'll tell you, if you ever have the opportunity again, which I don't know if will ever happen, but he really makes it very, very special. He's done a tremendous amount of research on the fort and is the ultimate expert on its history and its tales, which you're going to hear about tonight. A little business. Cell phones, can you please silence them or turn them off? And CCHA has books. Books.
I think the microphone doesn't work.
It works.
Am I not close enough? CCHA has books, all of Jim's books for sale in the back, and we also have a little donation jar if you care to drop a little something in there. It helps to fund the museum. I am extremely pleased and very honored to present to you my good friend, Jim Millard. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Very good. Wow, look at this crowd. This is wonderful. There's something about Fort Montgomery. People like to come to presentations about it. I'm always humbled by this. Up, bar, good? Close to it now. You may have to do that again. All right? It's always wonderful to have an opportunity to talk about this thing. 20 years now. 20 years I've been researching it. It's been a huge part of my life. I took a little bit of a break a few years ago, stopped presenting. It was just a little tuckered out, and I've just started again. And so this is kind of an opportunity for me too. I'm a little rusty. My voice is not as strong as it used to be. I'm a little concerned about those of you in the back. If you decide you want to ask me a question, you may have to shout it out. But if you can hear me, we're halfway there. So anyway, thank you very much for coming. This is a wonderful opportunity. It's a beautiful venue too, isn't it? Isn't it nice? Yeah. Well, anyway, this presentation is going to be a little bit different from what I've done in the past. How many of you have come to my presentations before? Oh, just a few. Wow. I'm really surprised. Because honestly, we've packed the house I don't know how many times in the past, and so I thought for sure there would be some repeat customers here, and there's just maybe a handful. Well, so hopefully you won't be disappointed. There won't be new stuff for you. How many have been? Any of you been on my tours? Tours of the fort. once again, just a couple, three. Okay, well, this is good. We've got a bunch of novices here. How many of you think you know a lot about Fort Montgomery? Okay. It's a brave group, brave group, okay. Well, I'm hoping that there'll be something new for you here. Honestly, this has been a wonderful opportunity for me. I've spent a lot of time, National Archives, just about every potential repository of information, a lot of stuff, but you have to work hard to get it. And I am excited to do this because there's so much misinformation about this fort. Honestly, I just am absolutely blown away by how much bad information there is. And in all honesty, our local media has been very, very culpable in there, because you look at the newspaper reports down through the years, and it's remarkable how they promoted a lot of bad information. So hopefully we can clear some of those things up today. Yes?
Speaking of promotion, I think one of the reasons that you didn't get a turnout, like to what you expected with repeat, is because of the lack of promotion. I love Fort Montgomery. Just a little explain. I came up from New York to see this, very important, but it was so hard to look it up. It was so hard to figure out, like the Chamber of Commerce should have done it. Like there was multiple things that I should have marketed, like this whole venue. So I just wanted you to know that I don't think you should take it personally. I think it was more on the promotion.
Well, I appreciate that, but you know, honestly, the place is full. So if too many more people had come, I think we would have been in trouble. So I wouldn't have wanted people spilling out the doors, but you know, that's point well taken, and so I appreciate that. So anyway, what I want to do is also, right off the bat, I want to thank the good folks from the Clinton County Historical Association. CCHA has been really, really good to me through the years. As we go through here, you're going to see a lot of wonderful photos from the CCHA archives. CCHA has sponsored me, I don't know how many times, to present. Jerry, I don't know if you know Jerry Favreau. I used the current, Helen's the current president, right? Helen Nurska is?
Yeah.
Okay, and Jerry used to be, Roger Harwood used to be, but anyway, Jerry is a person who, as she mentioned, took 7 tours with me. It's like my shadow for a while there. I couldn't believe she was always on these tours with me. But Jerry has been a wonderful supporter of mine, and I'm very, very grateful to her for that. Steve and Victor Pa, those are the owners of the fort. And I couldn't have done this unless they gave me unprecedented access to the fort. We kind of had a symbiotic relationship. It was good for them, and of course it's certainly good for me, but I did want to mention that. Roger and Doug Harwood. Roger is a good friend of mine, been a good friend of mine for a long, long time now. You're going to see a lot of Roger's pictures in here. None of this would happen if Roger hadn't been the person to knock on the doors of Power Techs up there and say, hey, there's this guy that wants to tell a story, 20 years ago. And he got me in there. Roger is not the shy person I am. So Roger did some great things for me. We also went on a lot of tours of forts. He's been an enormous amount of moral support for me. So I could, and Doug's his brother. Doug took some wonderful aerial photos. And you're going to see so many other wonderful photos here from people all over the country. People have sent me photos of Fort Montgomery from Alaska. They sent them to me from the Deep South. I've been sent pictures from everywhere, and I'm happy to share some of those with you. So let's get into it. Honestly, myths, legends. I am absolutely blown away by how much misinformation there is about Fort Montgomery. And this particular example right here is from the Plattsburgh Daily Press, on August 29th, 1936. This paper is no longer in existence. But I have to say this is my poster child, because there were no fewer than 18 factual errors in this one article here. 18. And I'm not going to get into what they were, but if you believe to some of these stories as we go through here, don't feel bad, because these are the things that you would have read, and they continue right up into the present day. Everybody is an expert on Fort Montgomery, it seems, particularly in this day and age and time of the internet. And as Roger and I both know, once you put pictures on the internet, they seem that it's open season. And so people help themselves to that. But if you believe some of these things, don't feel bad. Hopefully we can set you straight on some of these. This will be a little different from formats I've done in the past. What I'm going to ask you to do is show of hands from time. See what your knowledge is like about the fort. We're going to give a little bit of background for the two people out there who don't know where Fort Montgomery was. All right? I'm not going to point out the two of you, but I know most of you probably know where it is. But anyway, this is a map from National Archives from 1886. And I want to just set the scene for where we are. There, of course, is our Fort Montgomery. This is what's called Old Rouses Point. Now, this is interesting because I want to basically point out that it's different from what you have down here. Now, we know that Rouses Point has grown a lot. So Rouses Point is all this up here, but this little area we're going to talk about here, this Old Rouses Point actually played a key role in this fort up here. All right? We're going to talk a little bit about this. If you look really closely right here, there's a little bit of a clue here to one of the mysteries we're going to talk about. Now, if you've ever been up there, you notice there's a swamp there, all right? But we have what looks like a little road right here. Keep that in mind because we're going to talk about that a little later on, all right? So there's our fort, here's Old Rouses Point, and it's a nice way to basically get a picture of it. Here's one of the first pictures I'm going to show you from Roger and Doug. It really shows very, very clearly the area we're talking about. Now we live in an age of wonderful drone video. I was talking with a gentleman tonight who has made some amazing drone video, but when Roger and Doug took these pictures for me back in, just about maybe 10 or 12 years ago, I was absolutely thrilled to have access to them. So I think it basically helps you get a good sense of what we're talking about here. We're going to be discussing this Monument Hill a little bit. This is something the locals up there would ask me about. We know the military reservation itself is some 640 acres. It was actually far more than that masonry fort out there on what used to be called Island Point. And the Commons. The Commons was an area that local people used to take their livestock out and they would graze them on the reservation. The fort keeper, who we're going to talk about a little later on, would actually charge a fee to graze the cattle on the military reservation. And down here you have this Old Rouses Point, and we're going to talk some more about that. First thing, right off the bat, let's get this out of the way, all right? Fort Montgomery is Fort Blunder. Show of hands. How many of you believe that's true? Fort Montgomery is Fort Blunder. Don't be embarrassed, don't be shy. Okay, so there's about maybe 5 of you. This is a smart group here. You've done some reading. All right. Fort Montgomery, despite what you've read, is not Fort Blunder. I can't stress that enough because you can find it all over the place saying that it is, all right? That's a legend. And we're going to talk about legends and myths here today. Now, a legend, I didn't know the difference between the two early on. A legend is something that has a basis in fact. It was true at one time, and over the years it got embellished, or people basically added things to it. So a legend had some basis in fact, whereas a myth is a fable. Almost no basis in fact at all. It's just a nice fancy story that people have been telling, either for a short time or a long period of time. So we're going to find some myths and some legends here. But the fact is that Fort Montgomery is not Fort Blunder, and no matter how many times you may have read it, that's certainly not the case. This is what Fort Blunder looked like. All right. I'm going to show you a lot of segments and what we call detailed views from original primary source documents. This top one here is a plan of a section of Fort Blunder, the original one. Fort Blunder never had a name. It was referred to as the bomb-proof fort at Rouses Point, the works at Rouses Point, the battery at Rouses Point, but it never was named. Now you can find sources that will say that it was named Fort Montgomery. That's not the case, all right? It looked very, very different from Fort Montgomery. It was a small fort, much, much smaller than Fort Montgomery. And it really was only in active existence during the time it was built, from 1816 to 1818. And it was completely demolished, except maybe a little bit of the footings, in 1845. It never received an official name, all right? So this is what it looked like. 9 sides, octagonal. It was referred to as a first system fort, all right? This, friends, is what Fort Montgomery looked like, all right? Very, very different. This was a classic example of what is referred to as a third system fortification. Now, third system fortifications were built all along the eastern seaboard, some down in the south and one fort out in San Francisco. But they all had very, very similar features. And Fort Montgomery was about the perfect example of what they would look like. But Fort Montgomery had bastions. These are bastions. They were all had alphabetical order, starting with the east. You had Bastion A, Bastion B. You had what's called the gorge down here. The gorge was the western-facing front where you had the postern of the sally port. All the curtains were these things in the middle. Curtains with the straight sections between the bastions. And they had a numerical order, starting again from the east, curtain 1, curtain 2, curtain 3, the gorge, and so forth, all right? Fort Montgomery construction started in 1844, and it was finished roughly 1868, 1872. It took a long time because, like anything that required a lot of money, appropriations would dribble and drab depending on how things were going in the political climate. But it took a long time. But there were some stonemasons who actually worked on this fort for that entire period. Some of the very same, one guy named John Sweeney. He laid the very first stone. He was there when they officially pronounced it finished. All right. So another thing that's important is to know that Fort Montgomery did not receive its name until 1849. All right. That may seem like a small detail, but it's important because you could read in many places that it was actually named Fort Montgomery way back in 1816. All right. This is a side-by-side comparison of the two. All right. As you can see, Fort Blunder was much, much smaller. Much, much smaller. But those are drawn to scale. And there are not a lot of people that have actually seen what Fort Blunder actually looked like. Legend or myth? No one knows exactly where Fort Blunder was located. We know it was up there in Rouses Point. We know a rough idea. But does anybody know exactly where it was? What do you think? Show of hands, do we know exactly where it was? Yes? You think we do? You think we do? Where Fort Blunder was? Okay. Well, there are people that have said to me that we don't really know where it was, all right? We know it was up there, but it was one of those mysteries, all right? But we know exactly where it was because we have the plans. I was so excited when I found this down in National Archives. This is a marvelous document. It's marvelous because in many, many ways, it tells us a lot. It tells us an awful lot. First of all, this is the document for the plan and sections of a fort, no name, at Rouses Point. All right? This was 1844. Now, I actually have the document, the letter that went along with this. All right? Now, the letter that went along with this talked about what was going on in this plan. Now, what you see here is what is called the trace. Now, this is the trace of Fort Montgomery. All right? All they have done in this so far is laid the first part of the pilings, all right? You may not know that these massive walls actually were built on wood. They would drill piles. With the very first use of a steam pile driver in New York, in Lake Champlain. This steam pile driver would pile these enormous hemlock logs into the surface of into the ground. And then they would put what's called a grillage. And this is the grillage here. And the actual walls were built on top of that. So anyway, the most exciting part about this for me was, there's Fort Blunder. And the letter that went with this fort, this plan, said that at this point, people were working on the grillage, and they were disassembling the old work. So we could actually go out there today and walk on that parade. It's not called the parade ground, it's called the parade in that nomenclature back then. And we could actually mark the exact location of Fort Blunder. To me, that's exciting, because I've always had this, I mean, I'm not obviously for Fort Montgomery, but I've always had this wonderful idea of a preserved, interpreted property out there where people could actually see where Fort Blunder was. We could actually mark it. Roger and I were going to do that one day. We're going to go out there. We're going to take and put tape or something on it. We never did that, but we were actually thinking about it. This is a wonderful document anyway. One of the earliest plans of Fort Montgomery. So you can see a close-up of it. You can see, this is what's called the cover face. We're going to talk about cover faces here. You can see they're actually disassembling it. And you can see they're starting to build, put in the grillage of timbers in Fort Montgomery. Here's a question for you. Fort Montgomery was mistakenly built in Canada. Once again, I want you to be brave. How many of you believe this is true? Thank you, thank you. We have a handful, all right? I don't blame you. I don't blame you for believing that, all right? That's a legend. That's a legend. It's not true. Did you have a question?
No, it's just, I can see where people got the idea, because after the War of 1812, the border was moved north.
Right, thank you. Absolutely right. So anyway, the first fort was. Now, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, that's a little odd. The first fort was, we just saw that they're in the exact same location. But anyway, it's a legend. Let's think about this a little bit. So we have a border controversy. This explains the whole thing, all right? And this is one of my favorite topics because people really want to get a sense of how this all happened, all right? Here's another wonderful document. This is a British document, and this is from Canadian National Archives. And, excuse me just for a second, I don't want to lose my voice, because if I lose my voice, I'm going to get my daughter-in-law up here to speak for me. And so you don't want that to happen because... anyway, this is a document from the Inspector General of Fortifications in Canada. And this is a document dated 1816, I believe it is, maybe 1817. And it shows Fort Blunder. I like to refer to it actually as the works or the battery at Rouses Point. You can see it right there. Oh, I went too far. This is it right here, all right? And that little island was actually referred to as Island Point. You're going to see that a little bit later on. So this fort was built on Island Point, all right? But anyway, the 45th parallel, okay, was established as the boundary between the British colonies in the south and British Canada, or French Canada, Quebec, way back in 1763, all right? And in 1771, a couple of fellows called Valentine and Collins did a survey, and they put that line right up there, all right? So you had, this was the accepted 45th parallel. Now the 45th parallel was supposed to be the boundary, all right? You had America to the south, you had Canada to the north, if you will. That's not the proper terminology, but we'll leave it at that. So you see what happened is you have it right down there. Here the fort is. Well, after the War of 1812, the Treaty of Ghent, one of the provisions ending the war, was that the border would be resurveyed. There was no question about the border here in Lake Champlain. Now, there were a couple of individuals who thought, maybe something hinky about the border. But for the most part, people felt it was fine. There were a lot of questions about the border up in Maine, a lot of questions about the border over in what's called the Oregon Territory. But people felt it was fine. So they started here at Lake Champlain because they figured it was going to be a piece of cake. However, a British astronomer named Pierre and an American named Hassler discovered that the border was actually way down here, about 3/4 of a mile south. What is the problem? Big oops, right here. 3/4 of a mile, but look what's right smack dab in the middle of it. Just as that fort was getting close to being done, hadn't received any guns yet, but just as it was almost finished, they discovered that it was actually on Canadian soil. It wasn't the Army's fault. It wasn't General Colonel Taunton's fault. No, whose fault it was? These guys over here, Valentine and Collins. So, there's a problem. But this is how the first fort was built on Canadian soil, all right? Well, it didn't take long. It actually did take quite a while. It was until 1842 when a gentleman named Daniel Webster, I'm sure a lot have heard that name before, Daniel Webster got together with Lord Ashburton, a British gentleman, and they decided to finally, after all that time, they adjusted the border. They squared away all sorts of main problems to the west. And what they do here, they jumped it up just a little tiny bit to the old line. They adjusted it back to the old line to accommodate that fort. So by 1842, the Americans got that back. They got it back. And to this day, the 45th parallel is still the boundary, except here, where it goes up about 3/4 of a mile. A little tiny bit to get this property back. Fascinating. It really is quite a story. I have really oversimplified it, but that's what happened. So that's how the first fort was built in Canada. The second fort was not. Because as soon as we got that property back, what did we do? We started building another fort. All right? Anyway, this is a wonderful document. You saw the videos a little bit earlier on, okay? I want to read this to you. This is a sketch of the American fort at Rouses Point on the River Richelieu, about 20 chains south of the old line, found erroneous, and is considerably within the new established line or parallel 45 north latitude. It can mount 64 pieces of cannon and is bomb-proof with respect to its commanding position and is a seed plan of the boundary line. So this is a fascinating document, all right? We're going to talk a lot about what you see there in the background, okay, as we go on here, some of the other mysteries about this property. But I want you to take a good look at this right now because you see we got a lot of houses back there, we've got a little boat over here. There's a fascinating story about this here as we get a little bit further on in the presentation. Everybody still hear me? Right. Legend or myth? What do you think? The President of the United States visited one of the forts at Rouses Point. Think it true? It was James Monroe back in 1817, and he visited that first fort. All right. James Monroe was amazing. Some of the journeys he took. He took a tour of the northern frontier. He went up to New Hampshire, crossed Vermont on horseback, went to Burlington, crossed over to Plattsburgh, and then he took a steamboat up to Rouses Point. I'm going to actually see if I can read to you. No, I guess I can't. I'll have to get into my notes here. I want to do it a little bit later on. But anyway, what they did is they came up here, they docked at the dock here. He actually went in and he saw the still being built octagonal fort, the bomb-proof fort. Then he and his entourage went across the causeway. This was in July, so it was pretty much dry, so they got across the marsh there. And they went to this area here where there was another fort planned. Way back, they were going to build an enormous fort on what is called the Commons. Now this never happened, but this was the plan, way back in 1817, to build this multiple bastion, enormous fort that never happened, all right? But the president and his entourage did indeed ride all around there. And every time I go out there, particularly on the causeway, as a history buff, I always love being in places, things like that. It's a narrow little causeway, and I can just picture not only President Monroe, but people like William Tecumseh Sherman, Montgomery Mag, Civil War generals of great report, very, very important people. It's fascinating to see these things and think about these things, at least for me it is. Legend or myth? There were more than 2 forts that were built at Rouses Point. What do you think about that? We know there was Fort Plunder. We know there was Fort Montgomery. Anybody think there were more than 2? Because I've read there were more than 2. We have one hand back there. I've got a brave soul. Okay, thank you. I appreciate you raising your hand. All right. Well, that's a legend. Although, as we said earlier, there were others that were planned, all right? And it's fascinating to understand how this all happened. Right, here's your first one. This is the American Works at or near Rouses Point, Cantonment. So here you have the fort. Here you have a bridge across the swamp. And here you have some detailed plans of that very first fort. Sometimes people say that Fort Plunder had 2 forts. That's not really accurate, but there was an earthen redan. This was what is called an ancillary work or an outwork of the main fort work over here. But right at the actual point of Rouses Point, now this is where the bridge comes in today, all right? Right there was a rather large earthwork, which was an ancillary or an accessory fort to the main work over here. It was all part of the same complex, but people sometimes refer to that as a second fort, all right? Neither of those were armed, but this one was given up, of course, at the same time as that. But because this was an earthwork, it was not much was to take that apart. But it's sometimes referred to as a second fort. The third one, of course, is the trace I showed you earlier. General Simon Bernard was a noted French military officer. He is the officer who developed this system of bastions. And whenever you see a bastion fort, General Simon Bernard was actually the person who came up with that idea. And he was a master designer, and he came up with that design. Because up until that time, this is what forts look like. And from a military standpoint, they were nowhere near as defensible as a fort with bastions. This is our Fort Montgomery. This is a detail from another document from National Archives. This was, I refer to as Fort number 4, okay? But this is, right here, this thing called a cover face is an integral part of that fort. People don't realize that there's a masonry fort here, but there's also a very, very important earthen island, an enormous earthen bank, which was a key part of that fort. We'll talk a little bit about that a little later on. But this was Fort Montgomery, not just this right here, all right? But there's another one. There was another fort that almost got built, and this one is at Stony Point. Now, there was a period of time between 1818, when they lost that fort, and 1842, when they got that property back, where the United States military was really, really worried, because Lake Champlain had been like an arrow pointing into the heart of the nation for so very long. One massive military force after another had gone up and down Lake Champlain, right by that little narrow point. We know what happened in the American Revolution. You had Carleton, you had Burgoyne. During the War of 1812, you had Downey, you had Prevost who came down. And of course you had Americans who were invading up the lake towards Canada. So one invasion force after another had come down Lake Champlain because you had the ability to cut the nation in two. You could go all the way from the mighty St. Lawrence River, all the way down to Lake Champlain, all the way up Lake Champlain because it goes the other way, flows north. You had a little bit of a portage at Ticonderoga, then you were on Lake George. Once you're on Lake George, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to get to the Hudson River. So this waterway was justly called the warpath of nations. And so not having a fort up there really gave military engineers pause. They were concerned. And so in 1840, plans were developed to build a fort here at Stony Point. They were going to build a fort here at Stony Point to the south of Rouses Point proper, but they would have had to have an ancillary fort over there at Windmill Point because the way that the channel was set. It wasn't ideal, but that's what they were going to do. And so plans were actually drawn up. There we go. There we go. There's one of the plans. All right. I thought for a minute I was going to have to take it right out this back door. But anyway, this is one of the plans. Because Stony Point is so terribly marshy, it was even worse back then. The fort would have been very, very different. It would have had this enormous hornwork, which would have hugged the shore here. It would have had this amazing citadel in here. I've only shown you this one plan, but it would have been amazing if it had been built. But this was what they were going to do back in 1840. But Daniel Webster did his thing, and in 1842, Fort Montgomery was able to be built, and construction actually started in 1844. So that would have been number 5. All right. I see this all the time. I've seen pretty eminent historians, one in particular from Vermont, who wrote a book. He's long since dead, passed on, but he was not kind to Fort Montgomery. He did wrote as many people had done before him, that it was a waste of money. It was a blunder, not in the sense of a fort blunder, but it never should have been built. And in all honesty, I take issue with that. I don't believe it was useless. I don't believe it was a waste of money. I believe that is a myth because it served as an effective deterrent to war. To me, the most effective weapon systems are those that never have to be used. If they can prevent war, then they have served a noble purpose. I feel really strongly about that, and I am absolutely confident that this fort prevented war. It's really humbling to read the accounts from British officers stationed at Fort Lennox, just a ways up the river in Richelieu, where they are concerned about how they would take and attack the United States if they had to do that. Fort Montgomery played a key role in actually preventing conflict. And people don't realize, I mean, I've had people say to me, why would they build a fort to protect ourselves from Canada after the War of 1812? Well, not everybody knows about these different things that happened, but there were a lot of problems between the United States and Great Britain, right up until the Civil War. And there were times we came very, very close to war. I just listed a few of them here. The Canadians had their own rebellions back in 1837 and 38. Vermonters, New Yorkers, as they are, they decided to get involved. The Brits didn't like that. They took sides, caused a lot of hard feelings, ill will with the Brits. The border controversies, it's amazing how people how they feel about their borders. We almost went to war in 1838 and 39. It came very, very close to what's referred to as the Aroostook War, but it was a bloodless war, but only barely so. And Congress had appropriated millions of dollars to fight Great Britain because they were convinced we were going to fight. Manifest Destiny. There was a period of time when the United States was absolutely convinced that Canada belonged to us. That the Canadians wanted to be Americans, and that was just a matter of time. We have over on the left here is a House Bill 754, did not pass, but this is an actual document that was introduced for the annexation of Canada. How do you suppose the Brits felt about that? Well, in the halls of Congress, they were trying to decide whether or not they're going to annex Canada. Well, they didn't really ask the Canadians, but the Americans decided that was what was best for them. It was a fascinating time. We had incidents on the Great Lakes. There was a treaty called the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817. That caused a lot of problems. The American Civil War came, the British government came very, very close to coming in on the side of the Confederates. You'd be surprised how close they came. There was an incident called the Trent Affair in 1861, where, I mean, the Confederates obviously would have loved that. And it almost happened. The Confederacy almost had a very, very powerful ally. And once this happened, work on Fort Montgomery really got going, okay? And then there was the Fenian raids, even after the Civil War, where Irish nationalists decided they were going to take and start a real ruckus here. And basically they have raids up through Vermont and up in upstate New York, causing a real fracas in Canada, trying to literally get the United States and Britain to go to war. So that was the Fenian raid. So all of these things contributed to Fort Montgomery playing a key role in the minds of military planners. Here's a myth. What do you think? Actually, let me ask you this. Is this a myth? I kind of gave you a clue, didn't I? Plattsburgh Barracks was almost closed in favor of Fort Montgomery.
True.
I said it's a myth. You think it's a myth? No. It's true. All right. A person no less than William Tecumseh Sherman of Sherman's March, he was absolutely bound and determined that he was going to close Plattsburgh Barracks and move the garrison there up to Fort Montgomery. He was really impressed with it. Back in 1879, it was the first time he mentioned it. He said that this most valuable fort has never been garrisoned, but it should be, because that's the true key point of all that frontier. And then he went on to say that Plattsburgh Barracks should have been abandoned after the War of 1812, that it has lost its strategic value. And then, in 1882, he said the same thing. Fort Montgomery is a costly fort, nearly if not complete, mounting 60 Sea Ghost guns without barracks. And he wanted to basically, once again, he wanted to close Plastic Barracks, make it into a park, give it to the city. And he said it should have been abandoned after the War of 1812. Well, if that had happened, we wouldn't be meeting here. There would have been no Plattsburgh Air Force Base. Things would have been very, very different. But it wasn't just William Tecumseh Sherman. Other very, very important Civil War generals. Phil Sheridan, Montgomery Meigs, of course, who was one of the builders of the fort. But there's, the dates on this are interesting because these dates are late. These dates were after Fort Montgomery was complete. And these dates are after the Treaty of Washington, which was signed in 1872, where pretty much British had pulled all their troops out of Canada. And 1872 was seen as the time when finally Great Britain and the United States were going to be buddies. From that point on, there's no real threat of war. And here you have somebody less than William Tecumseh Sherman saying, wow, we want to keep this fort. No soldiers were ever garrisoned here. Well, yeah, they were, all right? It was garrisoned as planned. Now, this is important. The plan was that you would not garrison these enormous stone forts in peacetime, except with 1 or 2 men. They could have a wartime garrison of up to 800 men, but these were like big caves. And unless you actually built stone barracks or brick barracks on the parade, you weren't going to quarter troops here. So what they would do is they would have a fort keeper. It was usually a retired ordnance sergeant who lived in this building right here on Fort Montgomery. This was on the Commons. This was military property. This was where the fort keeper lived. This picture was taken by the last fort keeper, Sergeant Thomas Burke. Back about 10 years ago, his great-great-granddaughter came and gave me some wonderful pictures and took a tour of Fort Montgomery with us. And but anyway, this was where the fort keeper lived. So the fort keeper had to maintain the property. Early on, when there were guns there was an ordnance sergeant whose job was to take care of the guns. So the fort keeper took care of the building, the ordnance sergeant took care of the guns. And yet, it did receive a small garrison of actual troops during 1862, when there was concern about sabotage from Canada. And it says it was garrisoned for about 3 months in 1862 by a detachment of 15 men from the 15th Infantry. Well, why does this matter? Because a lot of the detractors of Fort Montgomery will say that the fact that it was never garrisoned was proof that it was worthless. All right? Well, it was not. That's not accurate. It was not garrisoned by design. All right. A large part of Old Rouses Point was demolished to build Fort Montgomery. This is interesting, folks. I find this absolutely fascinating. I'm not even going to ask this, okay, because no more shows of hands here, but actually, this is actually true. A large part of Old Rouses Point, remember I told you it was Rouses Point and Old Rouses Point, was actually demolished to build it. All right, but it's not what you expect. So right away, we're going to look at another one of Roger Harwood's great pictures here, all right? And we have a quote from a gentleman named Reverend Daniel Taylor. Now, Daniel Taylor was a fascinating clergyman, loved Rouses Point, loved Fort Montgomery. He wrote some wonderful stuff about Fort Montgomery, and you know the interesting thing about it? It was accurate. It was accurate. It was really, really well done. The guy did his homework. But anyway, he said, and this is a quote, "Old Rouses Point is well nigh obliterated by the government shovel. Its soil, however, rests itself proudly as the vast embankment on the west side of the fort." Well, he's talking about this thing called the cover face here. The cover face is this man-made island I alluded to earlier on here, okay? But what is this Old Rouses Point, all right? What I want to do is point your attention to this, all right? Here's the commons over here. And you've got, of course, this wetland here. This wetland, which incidentally is one of the things which has caused fits to people, potential buyers, over the years, all right? But you've got the area down here, which is actually the original point of Rouses Point. This is where the bridge comes in now, all right? This is the point of Rouses Point, the original point. But you see this area of trees right here? All right? Fascinating story about that. See, there's a little tree line here. This is the marsh, but you've got a line of trees that go up here almost to the border. All right? Well, in order to really get an understanding of what happened here, we have to go way back to 1815, and there's a wonderful map from the archives of the Clinton County Historical Association. This is the Tanner map. Now, the Tanner map actually helped us to get a sense of what this looked like before the first fort was built. So we have a detailed view of it over here, but you see here we have the point of Rouses Point, and you have this bank here. You've got the swamp, referred to as this great morass, but you've got the swamp here, you've got the highland for the commons, but you've got this embankment, labeled B right here. This was an embankment which was about 15 to 20 yards wide, all right? But it went all the way to the boundary, to the 45th parallel, what they believed was the 45th parallel back then. It actually went above it. Now this was referred to as Province Point because it actually was in the province of Canada. But something fascinating happened on that embankment, all right? The first settlers of Rouses Point built their homes on that embankment. So I have detailed views of two of these documents I showed you earlier here. First of all, let's go back to this one down here. There you see the embankment. Here you see Fort Blunder. But you see you have got the commons in the background, but you have all of these houses on that narrow embankment here. If you look up here, you've got Province Point up here. Look at all the little red, I put them in red. All these red structures are buildings, all right? You've got the redan, which is the earthenwork here. You've got Rouses Point right there. You've got a pier right here. You've got the bridge from the commons over to this embankment. You've got a guardhouse right there, but these were actually houses of the early settlers, all right? That was old Rouses Point. That embankment was solid enough and big enough to actually have homes built on it. All right? You can see those homes down here. Well, come 1842, Fort Montgomery needed to be built. And one of the things that a masonry fort was really vulnerable for was siege guns, all right? Now, people expected an enemy to come down Lake Champlain, like Downey did in 1814, and by ship. Well, if you're bombarding a fort by ship, you fired a gun, the ship starts bouncing up and down, all right? You've got your recoil, what have you. It was much, much harder to batter a stone fort from the water. But what if they came down like Prevost did and on the land, and they actually set up siege guns on the commons? Then what could happen is you don't have that. And so what happens is you could set up siege guns and you could really do a number on that vulnerable western wall, referred to in military parlance as the gorge. So it was essential to build this enormous man-made island. And to haul fill, this thing was 3 acres wide, over 3 acres in size, 250 feet wide here, 100 feet wide here, entirely man-made. And it rose to the height of the fort, 48 feet high. All fill brought in from the commons and from that embankment. You could listen, you could read the documents. They had 6 to 8 teams of oxen with boxes. You had laborers on there just taking that apart, filling those up, hauling them across the causeway to build that enormous embankment we now know as a cover face. But this was all man-made, and that's where it came from. It came from old Rouses Point. I'm going to keep doing that. But anyway, that's fascinating. All man-made. The cover face was big. Here you can see what it looked like. Get a sense of how big that cover face is. It's not the best picture, but I wanted you to get a sense of it. All brought in, drawn in by teams of pack horses and oxen. And it extended way beyond the walls of that fort. Fort Blunder, the first fort, had a masonry or stone cover face, but it still had to have something to protect it, that vulnerable western front. Here's another picture of the cover face, showing you how big it is. It's hard to get a sense of it today because it's all overgrown. It's all trees and brush, and it doesn't look like this. Now, in these early pictures here, there's a reason why this is not overgrown. Because the fort keeper's job was to keep it mowed. That was one of his jobs. One of his jobs was to mow that enormous cover face and the parapet. People don't realize that up on top of those massive stone walls was a big earthen berm to absorb cannon fire. And one of his jobs was to keep that clear. All right. So that's the cover face. Once again, another wonderful picture from Roger here. You can see, this is spring, you can see the cover face. It doesn't look anywhere near as big as it is, but here's that amazing, what's left of that embankment. All right. There's a reason those trees are growing there. All right. It's fascinating. And it actually went a little bit further. You get the Canadian border up, the Canadian border's up here. And it actually would have stuck a little bit further, and it was called Province Point. And there was for a while there was a tavern actually up there, from my understanding. And that part actually went into what they believed was Canada at the time. Never look at this property the same way again. And the next time you drive that bridge, just look at that swamp up there. Try to picture that embankment, you know. You can see the tree line, right where it was. All right? Legend or myth? I don't want to run, I got to start to talk a lot faster, folks. Vermont quarries supplied stone for both the U.S. and Canadian forts. Yeah, it's true. It's really interesting. If you go up to that wonderful fort up the Richelieu River, Fort Lennox, they have a marvelous tour guides, by the way. The stone for that fort came from the very same quarry as the American fort at Rouses Point. And think about it. They have opposing sides. And this shouldn't come to a surprise because during the War of 1812, the Vermonters were shipping spars for British ships up the lake to the British. They were driving cattle up there to feed the British troops. And so, this was done later, of course, but the same stone came from the same quarry, opposing side forts. Fort Montgomery was built of the finest granite stone. Well, that's not true. It wasn't granite. It was high-quality limestone. It came primarily from two quarries, Fisk Quarry in Isle Lamont, you can see it here, and Kings Bay Quarry down near Point of Fur. All right. I say this because there are other quarries that wanted in on the business, and the stone was rejected for one reason or another, either being too hard or too hard to cut. Some marvelous documents in the CCHA archives, the actual letters, where the quarry owners were actually trying to get the Colonel Totten, General Totten at the time to buy it. Here you can see the two different types of stone. The Vermont stone was darker. They actually had locally they referred to as black marble, but you can see the New York stone at the bottom, you can see the Vermont stone at the top. Two different quarries, two different types of stone, but it's all limestone, which is surprising. Limestone is fairly soft. Fort Montgomery was never armed. No guns were ever mounted at the fort. I don't know how many times I've seen this. Recent documents, too. Recent magazine articles, TV articles, TV stories. Fort Montgomery was never armed. Well, that's not true. Fort Blunder didn't ever get a gun, but Fort Montgomery was heavily armed for many years. We have the documents to prove it. Now, to this day, no actual pictures, nothing close up has ever been shown up, at least I've seen it, of Fort Montgomery's guns mounted. But we have the documents. This is an actual armament report from 1867, and this is basically saying that there were 10 10-inch Rodmans on the casemate level, another 10 on the barbette level, which was the top. Okay, so you had 20 10-inch Rodmans there. You had 8-inch Rodmans on the barbette tier, and you had 7 32-pounders. And you had a full complement of 40 flank howitzers. So these are the big anti-personnel shotguns, almost, if you will. These were designed to be fought at close quarters. I'll show you what these guns look like in a little bit. But the guns were there, folks. Okay, if you hear or read that Fort Montgomery never had guns, that's just not true. All right. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on this, but these are more plans showing where the guns were. All right. These are the actual documents. The armament reports were filed regularly. To basically the state of the conditions, state of the platforms, state of the guns. And so these are actual documents. This one is just from 1900, shortly before the guns they started to pull them. The guns started coming out in 1901. By 1910, they were all gone. All right. This is one of the only photos I've ever seen that give you even a hint of the guns. Here you can see, this is coming up the Richelieu, down the Richelieu River. You can see the guns, the 10-inch Rodmans mounted up here in the barbette tier. This front right here, every one of those embrasures, this was fully armed. It was a gun, it was bristling with guns because they expected an enemy to come from the north. All right? That's about as good as you're going to get, a picture of Fort Montgomery's guns. All right? This is what they look like. This is an actual document from the military. A Civil War document showing what a 10-inch Rodman looked like. These would fire over from the top tier. All right, they were mounted. They would turn on what's called a traverse circle here. All right. Roger took this picture down at Fort Clinch. This is what they actually would look like. They would, like I said, they would turn and they would actually fire over the barbette tier. There were casemates. The casemates were fired through the embrasures, through the actually, what you see, those openings on the second tier. These are casemate Rodmans, all right? There were 10 that were on site, inside casemates. There were 32 planned, but this is what they would actually look like. I took this up in Fort Knox, Maine. That's a perfect example of what Fort Montgomery's guns would look like inside the casemates. And these were planned, but they were never actually put there. Several of these big 15-inchers were actually on the parade, but they were never mounted. All right, this is what they would look like, enormous guns. They were largely obsolete by the time they were mounted, though, folks. All right. And flank howitzers, like I said, these were nothing but big shotguns. They would fire canister and grape shot. These were in all the flanks of the base bastions. There were 40 of these that were mounted. This is what they would look like. This is what canister shot would look like. These were like a weapon of last defense, of last resort. All right. And this one is an actual gun from Fort Montgomery that has been sitting in Isle Lamont in front of the library longer than it was at Fort Montgomery. It was removed in the first part of the 20th century, and it has been there ever since. If you want to see one of Fort Montgomery's guns out of Isle Lamont, it's really a thing to see. Beautiful little library there too. So anyway, real quick, were there ever small arms at Fort Montgomery? Well, if people thought it was never garrisoned, why would there be small arms? Well, yes, they have been. My good friend Charlie Barney, he's now passed, but his father was a policeman at Rouses Point. In the 1950s, he actually found this thing sticking out of a sandbank. And this was a likely model 1816 musket converted in the 1850s. And this is the only, to my knowledge, small personnel weapon that was actually found there, but it's a fascinating document, fascinating artifact. This is one of my favorite groups of slides here. Fort Montgomery was used as a campground at one time. Yes, it was. An individual named Elisha Goodsell. Elisha Goodsell was a fascinating entrepreneur. He ran ferries across the lake. He ran a quarry, and he also ran a campground here at Rouses Point. He was way ahead of his time. This is a brochure he had. He put out trying to get people to come to his fort, to his campground. This is a quote from it. It says, "Here's a view of the officers' quarters. These rooms have been refinished and are now available for campers and tourists." Now, if you remember, I talked earlier about how the military didn't want to put their people in these forts, in these barracks. And yet, he was trying to sell it as a campground. All right? Well, the campers didn't like it either. This was not a successful venture, but he was trying to do it. He said, "One of the finest specimens of ancient craft masonry in America. There are 64 skillfully finished rooms, numerous magazines." He refers to them as dungeons up here. Well, they weren't dungeons. They were the powder magazines. The fort has been equipped with electric lights and pure running water. Imagine Rouses Point, imagine that. Automobiles may be parked in the courtyards or on the grounds. Campers may come here, and on rainy days, the fort will be found to be a warm and cozy shelter. Well, I have to take issue with that. I can't imagine by any stretch of imagination it being warm and cozy. I think I'd prefer to stay in a tent on the parade. But anyway, he tried. It wasn't successful. If I had the time, I was going to actually read to you from the book an account from Harold Burke, who was the son of the last fort keeper. Thomas Burke was the fort keeper from 1914 to 1926 when it was sold in private hands. And his son Harold and his sister were actually employed by Elisha Goodsell as tour guides. And so they would actually take the people through the fort, and these young kids were supposedly,
Now, who owned the fort at this time when he was promoting it?
in 1926, it went through a whole series. It was actually sold from the government into private hands. Who owned it when Goodsell was leasing it? I don't know. I'd have to go back and look at it. But it went through a whole series of owners. Yes?
Did they actually at one point have running water and electricity? Because I've looked into doing something similar about 10 years ago, and the fighting with permits and stuff like that, I'd be very surprised if it was originally done.
Yeah.
So do you know if it was or not?
I do not know. All I'm telling you is what he says here.
Okay, all right,
yeah.
I'm just curious, because that would have saved a lot of
I know that the New York Times picked up on this, and they were basically talking about this tricked out fort, which is now going to be, what was their term, tricked out. Tricked out fort where tourists from all over the country can come and and engage in all sorts of activities at this fort? But that's a great question. I don't know, but Goodsell said they did. Anyways, that was fascinating. This is, real quick, I'm already running out of time here. One of the fort keepers set a fire and burned down part of the fort. Yeah, Thomas Burke did that. One of the things that they were supposed to do, as I mentioned earlier, they were supposed to keep this mode and the parapet. Well, one day he was up here on the parapet and he was actually burning the grass. Well, military regulations say you would never, ever, ever burn up there. Well, Sergeant Burke obviously had been burning for a while, and nobody made much sense of it, but he had got up there and he was burning. The fire got out of hand, and he had to take it and hide because the revolver he had dropped it and the bullets were exploding. And long story short, he's hiding. In the meantime, the service magazine covers were burnt down, and possibly the staircase covers were also destroyed too. So here's another picture of it a little later on showing different staircase covers here. It's possible, this is a picture from a much later picture, but it shows, that's an earlier picture, I mean, it shows the staircase covers. This is where one of the staircases was, and these are probably what burned down. I just want to show you what that looks like today. This is before, this is after. It's kind of sad to see, but it's the exact same location. There was a secret passage in the fort. I've been asked, I don't know how many times, what about the secret passage? People could swim into the fort from underneath the walls. Well, I have to say what that secret passage was. Long story short, this was where the soldiers' latrine was. All right? There's a secret passage. The east bastion stuck out into the lake. Okay, what do you suppose the secret passage was? It was not for people to swim into the fort. All right? And we'll just leave it at that. But the secret passage was indeed a passage, but it was not for people. All right? Soldiers' latrine. They expected evidently the soldiers to do some fighting while they're in there because there's an embrasure for musketry. All right. And finally, is there traces of an old fort on Monument Hill? No. I've been asked about this. It was up on the Commons. This was not part of an old fort. Rouses Point, as you imagine, was very, very prominent in the border controversies. Well, in 1845, a Lieutenant James Graham was actually up there surveying the actual boundary, and these were the piers of his transit instrument. All right, there are still remnants of it, but these are not monuments. These were actual pieces of that original transit stand that he set up where he would set up his instruments. It's kind of sad to see, but those were not parts of a fort, but those were astronomical. It was an astronomical. Here we see Lieutenant Major Graham there. He actually put his initials in the monument of the 45th. JDG, James D. Graham, 1845. These are in the city proper. Roger took that picture for me. I'd never seen it before. And real quick, I'm going to skip through these really, really fast. Montgomery was the place to be. And you went there, you were fashionably dressed. All right. These are some of the wonderful pictures that have been sent to me over the years. I love this. This is on the actual drawbridge. This is the drawbridge back there. This is the bridge to it. But I'm going to have to step through these pictures fast. But isn't that a wonderful picture, folks? Here's another one. Yeah. Look at that. I'm not sure what they were celebrating, but they're definitely all dressed up. Yeah. Yeah. We have some graffiti here from 1910. 1910. Anyway, I just love these old pictures. The kids, when they're playing, they're wearing ties. Yeah, they got their caps on. I love this picture here. People don't realize that there was actually a section here that was across the cover face. They actually had to drive through, which is actually fascinating. And Fort Montgomery was demolished for stone to build the bridge. I have to step through these fast. 1936, 1937, the fort had been in private hands for about 10 years. And Andrew Weston bought it to demolish for fill to build the Rouses Point Bridge. It started right here at the beginning of Bastion B, and it went north. Here they are placing dynamite. to blow it up. You can see the enormous size of those blocks of brick. You can see there, have the crusher there. Work started here and it went due north. There's the barges taking the fill out to the bridge. These pictures are all from the CCHA archives, by the way, Clinton County Historical Association. There's the crusher. That's looking due north to up the Richelieu. These pictures came from a gentleman named Ben Arno. I don't know where they originally were from. Ben gave these to me for my collection. It was a massive undertaking, demolishing this fort. Massive undertaking. So anyway, these were men doing work to be unthinkable today. It's unthinkable because, first of all, we'd never do something like that. And the work was incredibly difficult, but it was a depression. And they did their work well. I mean, they really did. If you think about it, this was the moat. This was the postern. When you think about those people that you saw earlier standing on the bridge, this is where they were. This is where they were. This is it today. Hard to imagine. Hard to imagine. These were the officers' quarters. All right? So I wanted to quickly show you some before and after. This is what you would see from the Rouses Point Bridge. Now, fortunately, Mr. Weston left part of the fort for us to see today. He wasn't doing us any favors, he just got tired of it. He got everything he needed, he wasn't really happy with what he got. A lot more bricks than he expected. He thought he was going to get all limestone. He didn't want all those bricks. But anyway, he did leave the southernmost part of the fort. This was what you see from the west. This is what it looked like on the inside. You can see the wonderful stairway covers that evidently got burnt down by the fort keeper. This is what it looked like inside. This is the tier number 2, the casemate tier. This is tier number 2 right here after they were done. That's what it looks like today. Before, then, and now. This is what you can see from the outside. This is just holding itself up. There's nothing really behind that anymore. Bastion B is largely intact, and Bastion C is almost completely intact. This is the bottom section. These were sergeants' quarters. These were storage rooms. These were large, wonderfully finished plastered rooms at one time. And the parade of Fort Montgomery was used as a cow pasture. That's true. We have people that actually drive the cattle out across the causeway to be grazed out there. And scouts would hold camporees. Yes, they were. Their patch was wrong, but it was interesting. They would actually do that. And as we wind down here, I want to ask a question here. Fort Montgomery is too far gone to have any historic value. What do you think? I've only showed you a few pictures of what it looks like, but I don't know if you have you ever been out there? No. Yeah. Do you think it has any historic value at all for preservation? Of course. I'm getting some yeses. Good. I'm glad to see that. All right. Because people do agree with that. In 1977, it went on the National Register of Historic Places. They don't do that unless there's value there. Historic preservation value. In 2009, I was asked to nominate the fort as a 7 to Save site for the Preservation League in New York. It was a lot of work, but I'm happy to do it. Unfortunately, nothing really happened, but they felt it was certainly worthwhile in its current state. I've always believed that that fort could be cleaned up, preserved, and wonderfully interpreted. Not restored. You're not going to build a Fort Ticonderoga out there. But along the lines of Crown Point. How many of you have been on the wonderful ruins at Crown Point? Yeah. So the important ruins of Fort Montgomery will soon be made safe, preserved, and properly interpreted. You think I have some good news here? I wish I did. Unfortunately, it's not. I don't know how many times people have reached out to me. They contact the pods, they reach out to me, they want to know what I think. And I have got my hopes up, I don't know how many times. And it never ever seems to happen. Maybe someday, but I got to say we're running out of time. Way back in 1986, 33 years ago, I have been showing this slide at the end of my presentations now for 20 years. 1986, the press Republican said this: everyone agrees the fort is in danger of complete ruin. It is. that vulnerable, the best preserved part of the fort, Bastion C, could very well collapse into the moat. And once that happens, it's gone. All right? But back in '86, 33 years ago, they said if something's going to happen, it has to happen soon. Well, I hope it does, but I don't know if it's going to. I'm not anywhere near as optimistic as I was when I first started talking about this 20 years ago. But that's that. Thank you. Thank you all so much for the opportunity. I did run late, and I sincerely apologize for that. I hope you don't mind. I have time for a couple of questions, do I, Jerry, or do we have to end now? Anybody have questions? No? Great. You guys are easy. Anyway, thanks again. Take care.
All right, we've been an hour and a half here after the talk, and people have not let this guy alone. It's Jim Millard, another great example of your enthusiasm and knowledge of Fort Montgomery and, of course, of entire Lake Champlain.
Well, nice to see you again, Calvin. You're like a shadow to me. You know, you've been really good about always being here at these presentations. As you can see, people love hearing about the fort.
Yeah, and I couldn't believe it when you folks said it was 10 years ago that Fort Montgomery Day. It just seems like maybe last year before. It doesn't seem like 10 years ago.
Time flies fast, and time is flying by for that fort, too. You know, you wouldn't recognize it today from what it was like after we did that big cleanup, 10 years ago.
It's so sad, and of course, people from my generation remember. I didn't myself, but I know everybody in Rouses Point and all my friends went out there and partied and whatever else. And my neighbors, the William Castine family, had their cattle there. They were very much part of the commons, and that was their property for a while. And but you have a website. People, I'm trying to stir up a lot of thought here, so people can find out more. You've got books and you've got a website.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
Well, the website was very, very popular at one time. It's historiclakes.org. But I started it, 20 years ago. And, it's harder to find now on Google because Google is all into mobile devices, and I have not made it into a mobile website. But all the material's still there. There's some wonderful information about Fort Montgomery. Historiclakes.org. People like the site when they find it. It's no longer one of the top 10 sites, but it's certainly still there.
Yeah, and you can find out more than just about Fort Montgomery. You can find out about
the whole history of the lake. Yeah, going way back to before Samuel de Champlain.
Before Samuel de Champlain.
Yeah, I wasn't there,
wow.
but we do write about him. We have his journals. So.
Okay, and books?
Books, I haven't published any since 2009, but they're still for sale. You can get them on Amazon.com. You can also, I prefer you buy them through a Clinton County Historical Association.
You're going to go into right there at the museum?
Yeah, I took a long hiatus, but I'm going to be working on a second edition of all the books. But in the meantime, right here, get them for CCHA.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I'm glad you were able to do this tonight, and maybe the people out there will look forward. There might be some more of these talks coming, right?
I enjoy doing them. Thanks a whole bunch.
Thanks. Jim Millard, in the history of Fort Montgomery. More than just a myth.